everybody. Thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Andrews, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today I have an interesting guest for the show. As anybody following the news, there's quite a lot going on where the state of Israel is often making headlines, and there's a lot of people who have very strong opinions one way or another. And today I've decided to perhaps upset and alienate the entirety of the audience and have somebody who has the non-Zionist position. So I'd like to introduce a very interesting and idiosyncratic writer, Mr. Non-Zionism. So if you would like to kind of introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about yourself if they're not aware of you.
Okay, thank you for having me on. Okay, so I moved to Israel now 10 years ago. At the time, it was with my wife and our first child. We're both from Britain, opposite ends of the country. I'm from the south coast. She's from Scotland. We moved here for what we might broadly call religious Zionist reasons. Since then, our family expanded. Thank God. My career situation stagnated. Also, thank God. So you have to thank God both for the bad and for the good. And the part that's relevant to my writing is that over time, and then accelerating in the last 3 years, my religious Zionist views just dissolved and fell away. And as that's the background behind my blog, Non-Zionism, which is just it's just me ranting, really. But the idea behind non-Zionism basically is that it's mostly a blog aimed at Jews. I don't know exactly, but I would imagine about 75% of the audience, at least regular readers, are Jewish. And it's for people who feel, correctly in my view, that they don't have to or don't want to believe in Zionism, and they don't want to have to be shackled to defending it, but also believe, correctly in my view, that anti-Zionism is also not something they want to be in any way associated with or embrace. And the idea of the blog is you can just be neither. You don't have to. You just don't have to believe in either side if you don't want. And the articles are exploring what that means in practice. There is a kind of broad vision behind the blog, which ultimately will, in theory, one day result in me revealing my grand plan for how to solve Israel and Palestine. But it's very slow in coming, and mostly I just kind of respond to whatever's on my mind. I still don't have an awful amount of time to devote to the blog. When our kids are growing up a bit more, maybe I'll be able to do more. But at the moment, it's mostly occasional stuff. But I think probably people who read it regularly have got the kind of general thrust of the vision and what it's about, apart from just complaining, which is what it's mostly about.
Yeah, and it's part of what I find interesting, and I suppose I'm a part of that 25% Gentile readership, since it's part of the vision and purpose of what I do with my podcast here is I'd like to have people who, the term heterodox has become, I think somewhat maligned, and maybe fairly so, because it's become kind of a meaningless cliche of, centrism by any other name, or, if you're a rightoid who doesn't want to own up to it or something like that. That having been said, if I wanted to, say, find like a Norman Finkelstein type, that wouldn't be very difficult to find and have on the podcast, or an ardent Zionist. And that's part of why I enjoy your writing, because there's genuine nuance there, and not faux centrism or, something similar to that. But that having been said, it is very much in the news right now for a number of different reasons that I would like to get into later. But I'm definitely somebody who has like a more than a passing interest in Judaism from like as an outsider, from like a historical and theological background, since I just find all different religions very interesting, like to read about them. So I'm curious if you are comfortable talking about it. I remember I was we were both former guests on Alex Kashuda, and when you were speaking to her, you mentioned you grew up in not quite a secular, but a more generically, not particularly deeply religious Jewish household. But you ended up becoming more, obviously to the point where you're willing to move to Israel, more seriously religious. And I was wondering, like, was there a theological background behind that? Because I see all across, it sounds like you're a little ahead of the curve. There seems to be a religious resurgence across the board for all different religions and denominations right now. But I'm curious to what was behind that for you, since that's always a transformation that I find interesting in people.
Okay, well, my one might be quite boring. So I grew up. The term that's usually used is traditional, which means it means two things. First of all, it means you keep some things, but you don't keep everything. And Judaism is a very practice-oriented religion. That's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. So traditional means you keep some things, but not everything. And it's usually quite arbitrary. It certainly was arbitrary in our case. But it also means another thing, I think, which is that the Judaism that you keep part of is Orthodox Judaism. So when I was growing up, I didn't know what Reform Judaism was. I never really heard of it. Reform Judaism, or even conservative Judaism, which is what the in America, that has traditionally been what 80, maybe even more than 80% of Jews have been affiliated with, those who are affiliated to anything. So in Britain, it's a bit different, and it's rarer to have that. It's not unheard of, but it is rarer than it is in America. So we grew up, the synagogue that we went to, depending on different periods of my childhood, sometimes once a month, sometimes twice a month, sometimes once a week, was an Orthodox synagogue. And the Judaism that I knew about was Orthodox Judaism. It's just that we didn't practice all of it. We practiced, there was no rationale behind what we did and didn't practice. It's just what I kind of grew up with.
Very a la carte.
Yes, but it wasn't my cart. It was my parents and my extended family's cart. And when I went to university, I just remember it happened to be that it's the case for everyone, that the start of term time in September, October coincides with the big period of Jewish festivals. So you have Rosh Hashanah, which is New Year, then Yom Kippur, which is the big fasting one, the Day of Atonement, and then you have the Feast of Tabernacles, which is 9 days. 9 days. So out of a month, almost half the month, especially, and then once you include the Sabbath as well, is taken up with festive days to some degree or another. And I remember that during the first couple of weeks at university, there's what's called in England Freshers' Week. I assume there's some kind of equivalent in America where you're supposed to sign up to all different clubs, and there's events, and it's very busy events.
Rush week, we call it.
Right. And I remember that I couldn't go to a bunch of the things because it was a Jewish holiday. And then other people were like, why don't you just go to the things? And I said, because it's a Jewish holiday. And I didn't really know why. And there was a small group of people at university, probably about 20 or 30, who were Orthodox, by no means ultra-Orthodox, certainly not ultra-Orthodox, but were Orthodox. And just kind of by default, because I was going to spend what's called Sukkot or Sukkos with them, instead of going to the normal students thing, I just kind of fell in with that crowd. And then that's how it kind of happened. Then I met my wife at university. She was also observant. Kind of similar kind of thing happened to her. And then we became what's called ultra-Orthodox when we got married. And that was also kind of an accident. I mean, really an accident, because what happened is that she was looking for a job after university, and it was just after the 2008 financial crash. So the job market wasn't very good. And she took a job as a librarian in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish school in London, which meant that she had to live in the vicinity thereof. And then when we got married, I moved in with her. And my community was ultra-Orthodox. So I became ultra-Orthodox. The only real choice I ever made, like sit down, make a conscious choice of doing this, was when I came to Israel, because that represented, to a certain extent, a rejection of my ultra-Orthodox community in favor of religious Zionism. So that was the only real conscious choice I ever made. And it was a terrible choice, completely wrong. So don't make choices, just kind of go with the flow. That's my advice to anyone on a spiritual journey. just vibe with it. And if you feel like making a choice, don't make the choice.
Duly noted. It's an interesting path. And I was raised in the Christian tradition. I think there is the idea of, the Lord works in mysterious ways and whatnot. And I would imagine there's a certain carryover there. But do you mind talking? Was it just kind of really that there wasn't necessarily something behind it as far as like moving to Israel? Since I find it interesting, and it's just I guess as a framing thing. I know I believe I've heard you speak about like the history podcaster Daryl Cooper, not very glowingly, and I have mixed opinions on him. But interestingly enough, like I feel like for a long time I was much more of a lefty type, and my opinion of Israel kind of reflected, oh, it's just colonialism, right? But ironically enough, his series on, years back, he did that series on Israel-Palestine conflict, which really kind of changed my perspective as far as feeling the empathy and seeing the appeal of the whole project from a more historical basis. Since I'm somebody who's kind of a history nerd, I love history and religion and the intersection thereof. And that kind of set me on a path of reading various like Israeli and Jewish historians on the subject. And I was wondering, was it literally just like, oh, it was kind of a I know you live in Israel now, but it feels like very English sensibilities, just kind of a series of events that kind of brought you there? Or was there any sort of like religion? Because that's something I really appreciate and admire about the certain aspects of the Jewish people, is this historical grounding that you don't necessarily see in specific, even like, you would see a little bit more historically in mainstream of like European Western society, so to speak. But especially like, since probably like the 19th century, there's been like a very concerted effort to remove yourself from history, so to speak. So I guess if that framing makes any sense, did that track to you at all?
So like I say, moving to Israel was the one real conscious decision I made in this whole process. And it was made because I got it into my head that the state of Israel, to borrow your phrasing, represented the reintroduction of the Jewish people to the stage of history. That we'd been sitting on the sidelines, waiting. And now it was time to quit waiting. And we're all going to go back to Israel. We've experienced a kind of quasi-miraculous process in getting there, military victories, etc. And now we're there. We're going to build the temple. We're going to have a religious state of some form, which is going to be a beacon of morality and ethics to the nations. And then I got here, and I managed to sustain myself on these kind of beliefs for about 6 or 7 years. And then, no, turns out not really. Not a beacon of morality and ethics to the nations. We're not the worst country, but with no beacon. And eventually, once I got over the hump, it's actually, it allows you to kind of feel slightly more at ease with your social surroundings, because once you're not expecting that everyone should be the world's best people and the world's best society, then you're more willing to tolerate their kind of foibles and stuff. Now, it's interesting you mentioned Cooper. By the way, I kind of agree with you that he's a guy that's hard to place, because you can read an article by him and you think, wow, he's sagacious. He's a very sagacious guy. And then you can open up his Twitter and think, this guy's a complete retard. What is going on? So his series on his series Fear and Loathing on Israel and Palestine, I don't think that I listened to all of it, but I did listen to parts of it. And I remember one of the commenters on it said something like, anyone who reads this and starts off as a strong partisan of the Palestinians or a strong partisan of the Israelis, he's going to end up to some degree much more moderate. There's no way of kind of getting into the history of this without thinking a lot of this history is really awful. These kind of two peoples have been put in this situation which they don't know how to get out with. And I really just hope that somehow or other things turn out okay. Now, Daryl Cooper himself doesn't seem to have taken this lesson from his own series. He seems to have taken a more radical lesson, that we're a kind of uniquely evil people. But then that all depends on whether he's on Twitter or not, or whether Tucker Carlson is inciting him to be stupid. But those kind of that podcast and other things, look, I used to have very, very extreme political beliefs. Like in some sense, I'm kind of ashamed about it, and in some sense, it's I kind of like, it's laughable. Like how could I really think this? But I did think this, and I know that lots of people still think this. I really did think Israel's never really done anything wrong with the Palestinians. We've always been provoked by them. It was always their fault. The only thing we've ever really done wrong that we can point to is we were too soft, we were too kind, we put our own soldiers at risk to defend them, whatever, to not take excessive civilian casualties or whatever. And I wasn't open to criticisms from the left or even the centre. So I mean, I was, and to some extent still am, like a very right-wing person in my non-Jewish or extra-Jewish political views. So, you know, I still count myself as a kind of a Moldbugist of sorts, and I was very, very heavily into Moldbug and the whole neo-reaction stuff. So any kind of criticism that came from the left was very easy for me to write off, and not without a large measure of justice, because a lot of the criticisms from the more radical end of the left certainly are unreasonable. But also, even a kind of a Matt Iglesias type criticism of Israel's actions at any point in history, I wasn't open to hearing. It was only from people like Daryl Cooper, people from the far right, that was the only way that I was mentally open to the idea that Israel might actually have done something wrong ever. Because they were based. So if they're saying it, then there's no reason. Now, there's also, you know, a certain section of those people kind of overtly Nazis, so you can also write them off. But someone like Daryl Cooper, who's based, and at least at that point wasn't anti-Semitic, or not anti-Semitic presenting, that was for me the first chink, or the first few chinks in my ultra extreme Zionism. And the truth is once you're open to it and you just start reading books, then it sounds like a cliche, because it is a cliche, but it's also true, which is that the history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict is quite messy. Both sides have done things that are regrettable. And it's very, very hard to put things back together again. And that kind of view, sorry.
No, take your time.
No, that kind of view is my, that's what I hold nowadays. And now, the difference, I guess, you said that I'm not just a kind of boring centrist, is that I practice what my wife calls anti-triangulation, which is that most of the time on the blog, I'm either fiercely attacking Zionist mythology or fiercely attacking Palestinian mythology, because I really do genuinely think that they're both very false and misleading worldviews that lead people to misperceive in a systematic way reality. But not just that, they're wrong for the same kind of basic reason. So back when I was ultra orthodox in London, I met there was this a Hasidic guy whose father was not Hasidic. He was what's called Yekish, a German Jew. Now the German Jews, it's not known about very much now, people don't talk about it, but the German Jews were the most fanatically anti-Zionist, extremely fanatically anti-Zionist in the first half of the 20th century. And some of them also even after the Second World War. And his dad was a big anti-Zionist leader within the Jewish community of England. And once someone asked him, a Gentile, he said, oh, so you're a big anti-Zionist. So that means you support Palestinian nationalism. And he said, what do you mean? I don't like Jewish Zionism, and I also don't like Palestinian Zionism. Now, at the time, I kind of wrote that off. I didn't, but over the years, I keep thinking about what he said there. And though I'm not an anti-Zionist in that sense. I'm not fanatically anti-Zionism. I don't think it's a profound metaphysical betrayal or anything like the kind of things he believes. But I do think that fundamentally, Jewish Zionism and Palestinian Zionism share many fundamental traits as kind of nationalisms based upon victimhood and based upon myth that legitimate in their followers this kind of self-pitying cruelty. If there's something that Palestinians and Israelis share, it's the capacity for being intensely self-pitying while engaging in intense acts of cruelty. And I think that ultimately the solution to the mess around here, if it ever comes, which it may well not come, I'm not saying it will, if it was to happen, would be that both of these two ideologies would unravel at once. Rather than the normal centrist position, the two-state solution, which is these two ideologies agree to split the difference, which I think is very unrealistic and almost impossible that it will happen.
Yeah, that's I think that speaks to a larger point that I do want to get to you with, maybe a little bit later in the conversation, since first off, I would say that's it kind of makes me think, I don't know, have you read there's a Israeli historian, Shlomo Sand, who wrote The Invention of the Jewish People?
So I haven't read it. I think I read maybe the first chapter or so, and I know it. I know what the thesis is. I know what the idea is.
I just bring that up because it was probably one of the most interesting books I read last year. I really enjoyed it. And for the audience at home, we can maybe get into the thesis a little bit more broadly a little bit later. But for the context of this part of the conversation, he's talking about, as you might imagine, the idea of the Jewish people as this continuity being invented, sometime in the 19th century, which I think there's some when you talk about also like the Palestinians and the Israelis having similar pathology, I think there's an interesting maybe parallel there between like the 19th century, Zionism rising out of like 19th century German nationalism, kind of that same stew, since I think these material conditions create similar pathologies, but will have, obviously different solutions, so to speak. But as far as like the solution there to the Israel-Palestine thing right now, I mean, obviously, if there were an easy solution, somebody would have come up with it. And I think part of what made me more, in addition to, say what you will about Daryl Cooper, I just said that as an aside, that was, Daryl Cooper 10 years ago versus today is very different things. But the idea, this very liberal, like, we just need to meet in the middle and find a compromise, it doesn't necessarily seem feasible to me when there are peoples who have fundamentally different values and fundamentally different ideas, that, there's not really a halfway point of reconciliation. Maybe a time in the past there could have been, and that was kind of, and I'm sure we'll get to this more, the aspects of like, the right or Yarvin that appealed to me. And, I don't really have a strong home to call myself politically or ideologically, but the limits of liberalism is, there's always this myth of like, we can find a good middle ground. Here will be, all we need to do is sit down, talk about things, we have common interest. Whereas in reality, and I would say many, increasingly more cases, but, I think particularly the case of Israel-Palestine, there's not really like a middle ground, so to speak. And I think that's part of what drew a lot of people, myself included, to, more conservative or right-wing ideology, is at least that initial hump of like, oh, these aspects of liberalism, leftism and what have you, like they're fake, they're very particular to a time and a place of like, the post-war world where there is a certain amount of hegemony, where these things could be enforced top down, and it feels like more natural conflicts are reasserting themselves.
So the problem with finding a compromise on the Israel-Palestine question is multiple. At one level, it's really quite simple. It's that the land area that these two groups are fighting over really isn't very big. It's very, very small. And just on a practical level, creating defensible borders on both sides is a really big logistical challenge. You can just about figure out defensible borders on the Israeli side if they were to split the country, but then the Palestinians wouldn't have it. And that's part of the problem, is when Israelis talk about a two-state solution, what they really mean, and they don't even talk about it very much anymore, but when they did, and the minority that still do, what they mean is that an Israeli state and a kind of Palestinian, not really a state. Like, it doesn't really have an army, doesn't really have an independent economy. It's still basically going to be dependent on Israel, and it would never be in a position to threaten Israel. And when Palestinians talk about two states, to the limited extent that they do, what they really mean is they mean one Palestinian state, which is purely for the Palestinians, and one Israeli state, which is for everyone. There's a Palestinian state which only has Palestinians in. All the settlers go away because they're all thieves. They can get lost. 100% Palestinian. And there's an Israeli state which is going to be a democratic state that gives equal rights to all its citizens. And we're also going to have a bit of a right of return. So it's going to be 50-50 Israelis and Jews, and etc. And the ideological component of all this is that both Israeli and Palestinian nationalism are based upon the idea that this land that they're fighting over is one kind of thing, that it's not really something you can divide, it's one thing. Now, one of the things that Zionists say that is true is that Palestinian nationalism is a very recent invention. That you can't go back to 1800, you for sure can't go back to 1800 and find any kind of concept of a Palestine that is a distinct entity from Syria or Lebanon or Jordan, that has, like, you know, they have these little like cringe Hasbro lists. What's the capital city of Palestine? What's the currency of Palestine? What's the language of, like, it isn't, it doesn't exist. But is that basically the borders of Palestine are essentially the borders of Israel, i.e. the borders of where the Zionists decided to build their country, and eventually where the Zionists actually did kind of succeed in building their country. That's what Palestine means. And fundamental to Palestinian nationalism, what makes them different from any other group, is their identity was forged under the pressure of resisting Zionism. So what Zionists take from that is, oh, Palestinian nationalism is fake, and therefore it should just go away. Just stop believing in it. But that's not, you know, that's not how things work. Like, it's a modern invention. It was formed in response to Zionism. It's therefore fundamentally antagonistic to Zionism. But that doesn't mean that there's a solution. That just means it's very, very hard to solve the problem. That nowadays, Palestinians do strongly identify as being Palestinians because they actually do have a distinct history from the other Arab groups in the region, which is shaped mostly by their distinct experiences with Zionism. I'm sorry, Hannah, it's one of my children.
No problem.
Okay. Okay, I think it's fine. And there's another Zionist cliche, which also kind of proves the point, which is they say, why don't the other Arab states take in the Palestinians? They're your Arab brothers. Why don't you take them in and absorb them into your country, and then the problem will be solved? And the thing is, if the Palestinians really didn't exist and they hadn't developed this shared history, then they probably would. The fact that they haven't, the fact that they can't, okay, there's all sorts of reasons why Syria, having a lot of refugees in it, might not want to absorb the Palestinians. But the fact that they just, as a matter of fact, haven't absorbed the Palestinians shows you that the Palestinians evolved. They didn't have it in 1800. They evolved over history, this separate culture, separate consciousness, to some, you know, separate dialect of Arabic, etc. And that was all forged. And what makes a Palestinian from Hebron and a Palestinian from Akko and a Palestinian from Jenin part of the same thing and not part of some other thing is ultimately their shared experience resisting Zionism and forming this collective identity to resist Zionism. And my point vis-a-vis the Zionists is that what you're saying is true in that respect, but it doesn't make it any better. And it doesn't make it a more solvable problem. And it makes it your fault. You did this. You know, you have this massive problem with the Palestinians. You created them. They didn't pop out of the earth. There were these people. They could have evolved. Their cultural identity could have evolved in a different way. Without Zionism, it definitely would have evolved in a different way. We don't know exactly what, but probably it would be some kind of pan-Syrian thing. But what happened. And now you're stuck with this kind of nemesis situation. Now, there's something that like people don't realize about how profoundly Zionism failed, because they don't really understand what the original plan of Zionism was. Yeah, the original plan of Zionism was that there were, at the close of the 19th century, there were about 8 million, 9 million Jews in Europe, most of them in Eastern Europe, most of them subjects of the Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire expanded greatly over the last century and absorbed most of the Jewish population. And this had led to a massive downward social mobility among the Jewish population of Eastern Europe. Basically, they've done pretty well under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were a kind of merchant class. They worked a lot in tax farming. They worked as enforcers for the aristocracy, etc. Once Eastern Europe was taken over by the Russian Empire, the status of Jews went massively down. Other things happened. For example, the general rise of literacy meant that a lot of the competitive advantages that Jews had had economically just went away. And also their population had expanded massively, and just the kind of the niches that they traditionally filled, they didn't fill. So you have this situation where you have these Jews of Eastern Europe. They had a common language, Yiddish. They had a common culture, Judaism. They had a common ethnic identity. They had common laws regulating their action and stuff. And basically, they wanted somewhere to go. And for various reasons, the Zionist movement decided that Palestine, the Levant, was the place for them to go. And the idea was this: when Zionism gets started in the 1880s, there are around 500,000 people in Palestine, of which maybe 50,000, 60,000 were Christians, 450,000 were Muslims, something like that. If someone wants to correct me on the figures, but these are roughly what it is, I think. Who were speakers of Arabic, but didn't really necessarily have a strong Arabic national consciousness. The vast majority of them didn't. And the idea was simple. There are 8 million Jews in Europe. There are about 500,000 non-Jews in Palestine. If even 1/4 of the total population of Jews in Eastern Europe go to Palestine, then you've already got a 4/5 majority. And a 4/5 majority is fine. How do we know it's fine? Because in Israel, without the occupied territories now, there's a 4/5 majority of Jews. And it's okay. It's not perfect. There are racial tensions. Once every 20 years, there are even race riots. There are the kind of normal problems that an American who knows about the issue of whites and blacks will recognize: disproportionate numbers involved in teenage delinquency, blah, 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 all that stuff. But it's okay. It's not a disaster. Things aren't falling apart. Things, you know, they have their towns, they have their neighborhoods, blah, 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 blah. It's okay. The problem is that the population, the Arab population of Palestine, started expanding very rapidly. Why? Because that's what happens to every part of the world when certain basic things come in. People come and drain the swamps so they're not all dying of malaria. Basic child nutrition, eventually, you know, antibiotics eventually, etc., etc. So the population of Palestine from about 1900, the Arab population starts taking off. And actually the Arab population rises faster than Jewish immigration. Even at the fastest period of Jewish immigration after the Balfour Declaration, when the British for about 15 years were actively supporting immigration before they changed policy, even during that period, Jewish immigration was barely outpacing just the natural rate of growth of the Arab population. So you ended up with a situation which the Zionists never predicted, which is, instead of massively outnumbering them and therefore being able to do with them what you wanted, which in the vast majority of cases, the Zionists thought, we'll treat them nicely. They'll be a minority and we'll treat them nicely. You know, we know what it's like to be a minority. We're not going to be nasty, blah, 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 blah. It will be fine, right? That was the view of Herzl. That was the view of all of the Zionist leaders. Even the view of the right-wing Zionist leaders like Jabotinsky, that's what they said. We'll outnumber them and we'll be nice to them. But the point is, by the time things actually come to shove, they weren't in the position to decide how they're going to deal with the Arab minority, because the Arabs weren't a minority. In 1948, when the State of Israel was established by the United Nations, or granted by the United Nations, 1947, Arabs were still, even after this kind of wave of post-war immigration, they were a majority in the area. And over the course of these 60 years of Jewish immigration, not only had they outpaced the Jewish population, they had developed this political identity, which by that point had spread throughout most of the population, which was extremely hostile to the whole idea of Zionism. And so the Zionists dealt with the complete failure of their project by, well, through mass ethnic cleansing. That's what happened. And most Zionists nowadays, they or Israelis or Jews or whatever, they have no idea what I just told you. Basically, what they think is like this: is that the Jews came to Israel, they knew they were Arabs, and they had some kind of plan to share. And the Arabs said, no, we're not sharing, and that's why the war happened. That's the Jewish narrative. But the plan was never to share. They only agreed to share once their original plan of just outnumbering them completely failed. And at that point, they kind of agreed to share, and the Arabs said, no, we're not sharing, because from their perspective, why should they share? They're the majority, and it's their place to start with. And you haven't succeeded in your plan of outnumbering us, so why should we share with you? I don't know if that answers the question. I actually don't remember what I said.
No, it's interesting stuff, and I guess that kind of it's a good segue to some of the other topics I wanted to talk about. Since I'm somebody who is very interested in history and religion and philosophy, so I could talk about this stuff all day. But I think part of the reason that your blog is, popular with people outside of Israel who aren't Jewish, etc., is because obviously it's a big topic in the news right now, especially in the United States. And just as far as like what you're talking about with history of Israel, the Palestinians being a cohesive identity being informed by contact with Zionism, etc. I mean, by that same logic, you'd say, okay, well, the Ukrainians aren't a real people, right? Because they're shaped in the same way as by the Russian Empire, or blacks and Americans by their at a certain point there's a responsibility, or at least the point you have to deal with it. But that all having been said, I think again it comes back to especially I don't necessarily want to get into the whole Jeffrey Epstein of it all, because that's its whole other thing that I don't have a huge interest in. But there is this particular relationship with the United States and Israel, also the United Kingdom as well. And I think that's what has really come to a head in recent years. And, personally, I'm of the opinion, that I'm not really a, grand Jewish conspiracy person. I typically believe, if you look at what's now called Israel, this part in the Levant, basically all throughout history, literally every major empire has either controlled or made alliances with it, because it's a very geopolitically important place, and it always has been, likely always will be. But that is kind of where we find ourselves today, where it's become a hot button issue, the relationship between Israel and the United States. And again, I tend to believe that it was a geopolitically important place for the United States, particularly in the context of the Cold War. The degree to which it is still geopolitically important, that's maybe its own separate conversation. But I guess I'm curious to the two directions I wanted to take is how, as somebody who actually lives in Israel right now, what is the thought about that relationship? There's a lot of reevaluation in the United States, as well as Israeli society itself more broadly. Maybe we can go to next, since you've wrote a lot of interesting things about Israeli society, vis-a-vis all the divisions that exist. Since and I read broadly in rightoid and leftoid spaces, so to speak. There is this idea that Israeli society is a monolith, and it can be scapegoated into whatever your bugaboo is. But I guess whichever direction you want to take that first, because those I think are the reason that, because I would, like I said, I'm the type of person, I would find this type of esoteric religious history and border lines on maps, so to speak, I would find it interesting regardless. But there's a lot of less thoughtful framings of the subject, to be delicate, right now in the United States political social sphere right now.
So I think with the case of the United States, traditionally there's been two sources of support for Israel, over and above what would exist in any kind of generic Western country. One is that you had, mostly concentrated in the Republican Party, this extreme, I use the term just kind of contextually, but this strong pro-Israel, we love Israel, Israel's the greatest kind of country in the world, Israel's fighting our battle against Islamic whatever you want to think. It's a beautiful, inspiring story. They've come back to their homeland, they're fulfilling biblical prophecy, whatever. You know, Christian Zionism, Ted Cruz, right? Which is something that in European countries or other Anglosphere countries just flat out doesn't exist. It's just not a thing. Like, it's not a political thing, let's put it that way. There are weirdo Christian evangelicals in Britain too who are Christian Zionists, but it's not a political force. No politician panders to such people. It doesn't exist. More recently, you have got in Europe some parts of the far right, for whatever reason, partly it's kind of a way of kind of like saying I'm not Hitler, have adopted this very strong, yay, Israel, we love Israel thing. But that really only started about 10 years ago, whereas it's been a big, there's been a big force in American politics. Like, remember, I think when Trump was running for president the first time in the nominations, and I remember Ann Coulter, they went, person by person by person, just saying, how much do you love Israel? All the different presidential candidate nominees in the primaries. How much do you love Israel? I love Israel this much. I love Israel even more than you. No, I love Israel so much more than you. And Ann Coulter wrote, like, how many Jews do they think there are in this country? Like, what? What are you talking about? Why is this like 5 minutes, 10 minutes of your 1 hour debate? So they had this pro-Israel Christian Zionism culture, which was also related to the what was they called? Islamo-critic and counter-jihadists. Yes, that kind of subculture as well. So that's something that only existed in America, really, as a political thing. And then you also had the other unique thing, which is probably more important, is that the left-wing party in America was not pro-Israel in that kind of same unhinged way, but pro-Israel. Traditionally, the Democrats have been a pro-Israel party. We like Israel. There was no real place for like I hate Israel politics, which again is something that in all other Western countries is not the case. Usually the left-wing party is pro-Palestinian, like in a happy way, and the right-wing party is pro-Israel more in like a happy way. That's how normal Western politics work. Whereas in America, the left-wing party had what in most European countries or Anglosphere countries would be considered the conservative position, which is like, we like Israel, we'd like there to be a two-state solution as well. We don't hate Palestinians, but we like Israel. Israel's good, democracy, our friend, this kind of stuff. So Israel benefited from these two things, and which were important because America is just much more important than any other country. It matters far more what Americans think than it matters what Norwegians think. And both of them have started to fall apart and fallen apart very rapidly at the same time. So I think, it still takes some time to trickle all the way to the top. But I think, someone like Mamdani can become the mayor of New York as a Democrat candidate. How much does he hate Israel? We don't really know. But the point is, he's identified as someone who doesn't like Israel. And to some extent, he doesn't like Israel. And there's no way, even 10 years ago, he could have been the mayor of New York. And now he is the mayor of New York. So in at the very least, in the Democrat Party, being anti-Israel, let's put it this way, being pro-Palestinian, saying, I support Palestine more than I support Israel, no hatred, is a mainstream position and probably is going to become the mainstream position. Like the same, just as in the Labour Party in Britain or whatever the equivalent is in Canada, the mainstream left of centre position is I support Palestine and I want there to be a two-state solution, as opposed to I support Israel and I want there to be a two-state solution. That's going to be the mainstream Democrat position as well. And on the right, this aggressively pro-Israel, we love Israel, Israel's the best, Israel's fighting our wars, Israel is biblical prophecy, if Israel is blessed and I bless Israel, I am blessed, blah, 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 is really falling apart because it's just, the Tucker Carlson interview of Ted Cruz was just this moment where just almost everyone who's under a certain age, and I don't think it's even that old an age, it's probably like 50 or something, was just like thought Ted Cruz came off like a complete idiot in that interview. Because it's something that something snaps and it's just considered, it's laughable. What do you mean that like, and Tucker Carlson, I genuinely think is a very malignant person. I think he's deliberately, I basically agree with the Richard Hanania view on him, that he deliberately poisons the public sphere for money or for dopamine or for something, whatever. But the area where Tucker Carlson is best, because it's just the easiest thing to attack, is Christian Zionism. it's just so easy for him to show that it's absurd, it doesn't make any sense. It's got so many weak points. I mean, the most obvious weak point is all the the Christians who are actually in Israel, Palestine, 90% of them are on the side of the Palestinians because they are Palestinians. The whole biblical, its whole basis in historical Christianity doesn't exist. It's ridiculous. It's a heresy, basically. Tucker Carlson is basically right. Christian Zionism, at least in its strong forms, is basically heretical according to traditional Christianity of any stripe. And if we would say, even for the sake of argument, let's say that the crudest version of being anti-Tucker Carlson is true, that Tucker Carlson is literally a Russian spy or something, right? And he's just trying to destabilize America. His most effective weapon is poking Christian Zionism, because that's where he sounds most sane, because that's where the previous establishment position or part of the establishment position sounds most insane. The Christian Zionism is very quickly becoming something that is just regarded by all normal sane people as laughable and if not actually demented. So these two sources of support for Israel are drying up very, very rapidly at the same time. And in the case of the Democrats, moving from being a kind of pro-Israel, pro-two-state solution to a pro-Palestine, pro-two-state solution party, a lot of it has to do, you mentioned Jeffrey Epstein, and I'll also be brief about it, is that the American elite used to just be very, very Jewish, a lot more Jewish than it is now. And what we see with the Jeffrey Epstein thing is that he was able to get as far as he was just because there were so many Jews around, and there was a certain cultural camaraderie with, if Noam Chomsky wasn't Jewish, he was Chinese, it's almost certain he would not have found Jeffrey Epstein's company as interesting as in fact he did. There's a certain, Steve Saylor talks about this, and it's something that even I don't know so much because it's quite more specific, American Jewry, which is not my background. There's something about Jeffrey Epstein's cultural cachet that made Noam Chomsky, who they came from sort of the same neighborhood of New York, that same kind of culture, just attracted to him. And the fact is just that part, the left-wing part of the American elite, which is most of the American elite, is just becoming much less Jewish. The Chinese immigrants are coming in and they're outcompeting the Jews on the mass side of things. The Jewish population is declining quite rapidly through intermarriage, and a certain proportion of intermarried people in any given generation will cease to identify as Jewish, and also just cease to be. They just are less. Mark Zuckerberg's children are not going to be very culturally Jewish. It, just isn't going to happen. And so the elite is just becoming a lot less Jewish. The elite of the Democratic Party, the Democratic elite, is becoming a lot less Jewish, and as a result, they're just going to be less instinctively sympathetic to Israel, and it's just too bad. And Israel has to get over it. There's nothing you can do about it. And in some sense, there's definitely the case that Israeli influence over American politics has been very large and very ostentatious. But the extent to which it's ostentatious shows that it was never quite as strong as people think, because real power doesn't show off about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have real power, you don't have each Republican candidate standing up one after another saying, I love Israel more than you. I love Israel a bajillion. I love Israel 60 gajillion. I love Israel a gorillion, right? And the Jews kind of, one of our weaknesses is it would have been smart for us to kind of tone that kind of stuff down, because it only takes a few court jesters to pop up and go, whoa, isn't that a bit weird? Why are you talking about how much you love a foreign country? And if there had been a few more Jews actually pulling strings instead of just going with the flow, I think that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they would have said, whoa, yes, we want your money. Yes, we want your F-15s, but you don't have to talk about this in public. What are you talking about?
Yeah, if I will
show
say,
about it.
If you folks were, the grand puppet masters of the whole media thing, I got to say, not doing a great job at it in that context. Since it's, I do always think it's funny that there's on the right and the left, there's just these Israeli mastermind puppets. When I think of it as very thuggish and very unsubtle, kind of like you alluded to, but it's a complicated thing, since there's two different schools of thought, and part of what again drew me to your work is, I would love to only oh wow, what an interesting esoteric thing to learn about the history of this people in this country, so interesting, but it is a major political and cultural hot button issue right now in the United States. And especially given, you're talking about this maybe inorganic right-wing identification with Israel and Europe. You could say maybe it's an I don't want to be called a Nazi thing. I think there's maybe something to be said for demographic changes in Europe, and maybe they're starting to see the dynamic and model that Israel has, and the right in Europe is probably maybe sees a little bit of a future for themselves, and that would be my guess. But that having been said, like I would when it comes to the United States context, I'm on one level, like I've heard it called the peasant pill. Like I should probably not care about this at all. I'm just some guy. I'm no mover and shaker by any means in my real life. Mid-level white collar tech job type of thing. That having been said, like I do think be it the moves that the Biden administration, the Trump administration made, I tend to put it on much larger historical trends and forces. But that having been said, it feels like the place of the United States is really moving, and I do think there is a good argument to be made for continuing to at least have a good alliance diplomatic with Israel, since it's, like I said, basically from the United States to the British Empire, Ottomans, Romans, Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, etc. This has always been an area that's either been controlled or had a geostrategic importance. So I think there's something to be made there. But I would be interested I think there needs to be like a renegotiation culturally, since I'm somebody who I have more than a little bit of affection for, at least, American Jewish people. I grew up in an area that had a lot of Jewish people, dated Jewish women. There's I won't get too deep into it. There's a alternate history where I kept dating one girl and we might have ended up being neighbors, but that's neither here nor there ultimately. But I do think that it's something that I feel like a friend of the show, I think you've spoken to him before, Ancient Problems. He says the degree of like a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States is kind of like basically anti-boomerism, because there's a certain cultural the way that it's expressed now, there's not really a context for, and at least for me personally, like it's something that needs to be renegotiated. Since I remember, like, something that really rubbed me the wrong way personally was like, and I won't get into too much grievance stuff. I remember like Netanyahu giving a speech. It's like, oh, nobody helped us during World War II and the Holocaust. It's like, oh, I'm sorry. Was it all the millions of American men and all these other people who died? That wasn't help. That type of thing I feel is very, I think it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So I'll be interested to see, and or what your opinion on is, if this do you see this relationship continuing? And I know you're just one guy, as am I, or being renegotiated, since I feel like Netanyahu is kind of like a Trump-like figure, in the sense he's very brash like that. And I do kind of have a theory that like he'll probably get basically the whole Gaza thing, or gregariousness of recent Israeli actions could just be, he could kind of be scapegoat and like, all right, no, we're good and liberal now, or there will be like a JD Vance, as he is to Trump to somebody for Bibi. So I guess how do you see that going? Since me personally, like when, to the degree that it matters to somebody like me, I would like to see, a relationship continued, since it makes sense as we go towards like a more multipolar world, all this. But I think they're definitely for both sides of the ocean, so to speak, there needs to be some sort of renegotiation, like politically and culturally.
So one of the themes of my blog basically is, are Jews, or I would like for Jews to be able to navigate this cultural sea change without acting like total psychos. And so far, the prognosis is not good. The Zionists are so used to this kind of on at least on the field of public opinion and public debate of playing with these massive advantages at their side, the ones I talked about before, that they really react very negatively just to kind of equal treatment. As in, if someone just approaches it with a kind of, I don't really know anything about this, there's Palestinians, there's Israelis, you explain to me why you're right and they're wrong. Even that kind of like framing of it, what do you mean I have to explain to you? Don't you see the Holocaust? You don't know about October the 7th? How can you possibly say that these Islamo-fascist, jihadist Nazis, blah, blah, whatever, could possibly be right? Like, there's the idea that they might have to actually justify their case without being able to rely on the fact that Christian Zionists are like, woo, 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 Israel, and the fact that the Democrats are like, we like Jews, Jews are our friends, etc. They're not taking it well. They're not taking it well at all. And unfortunately, they have it's a self-defeating thing, but they have this ace up their sleeve, which is they can always say, it's not that we're being asked to justify our case on an equal playing field. No, no, no. It's because of the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And the problem with that is there is, at the same time, genuinely a resurgence of anti-Semitism. That's a fact. Like Candace Owens, Candace Owens just is an anti-Semite. I mean, maybe she doesn't believe anything, so she's not really anti-Semite. So maybe she's just schizophrenic. But she is advocating anti-Semitism. If anybody in their history has ever advocated anti-Semitism, Candace Owens is advocating anti-Semitism. So this is a real thing. And it's not a fringe thing either, because she has, 8 million podcasts?
It's one of the bigger podcasts right now, yeah.
Right, it's top 10 politics podcast subscribers. And she just gets up and says, Jews, 2,000-year war, they killed Christ, they want to kill Christ again, whatever.
All the classics, right? Playing the hits.
Right, proper, all the things. And it makes it so easy for the Jewish community at large to say, aha, you see, everything that's going on really all comes down to anti-Semitism. And therefore, I don't need to defend myself. I don't need to explain why Israel is right. I don't need to explain what Israel has to offer to the United States, because the very fact that someone would dare to ask such a question just shows that they're motivated by hate. And the proof is Candace Owens, or the proof is that, some very far left people and some Islamists after October the 7th, had a demonstration and said some very disgraceful things, which are genuinely very disgraceful in defense of what happened on October 7th. And unfortunately, people within the Jewish community who have extremist views that they know are unsellable to the global public and to the American public, because unless you're already completely 100% on Team Israel, how are you possibly going to justify just my solution to the Israel-Palestinian problem is we kick out all the Palestinians and take all their stuff? Like, that's not a sellable proposition, but it's what they want to happen. It's what they believe. And a large part of their strength over the broader Jewish community is that they can say, they create this siege mentality, which is, everyone's just anti-Semitic. We don't have to explain our case. Come to us, we'll protect you. Jews stick together, blah, blah, blah. So this is extremely, it's a situation that the Jews are going to have to deal one way or another with. That they had a very good situation, and now the situation is going to get less good, and they have to navigate it intelligently. And they're showing, as a community, we are not navigating. We're navigating as poorly as possible. Our public representatives are repellent. Seem to go out of their way in many cases to be repellent, and maybe we just can't renegotiate this new cultural situation. And one thing, Bibi was asked on Israeli TV. He was asked. He said, "Well, what are you going to do? Because not everyone is stupid." So he said, "What are you going to do about this new situation in America? Like, anti-Zionism is going through the roof. All these opinions that once used to be fringe now are mainstream. Like, it's never been such a worse environment for pro-Israel advocacy in America." So what are you talking about? Everything's great. It's never been better. Why? Because what's he talking about? He's talking about the Trump administration. Because at the same time as the general rhetorical environment has never been worse, the actual policy of the American government has never been more favorable to Israel. Never. And that's because Trump, himself is a kind of renegade New York Democrat who comes from this heavily, and he just, at a very instinctive level, his team includes Jews. It's not just Jews, but Jews are on his team, which is corrupt New York people. Right? And also because an important part of his administration, which is supplying a lot of the money and the brains, are committed Zionists. Some of them Christian Zionists, some of them Jewish Zionists. So the American administration is very favorable. As far as Bibi is concerned, everything's fine. What are you complaining about? I get almost everything I wanted, one I've ever got out of any other administration. And we're not even trying, like the kind of thing that you're suggesting, basically, which is saying, look, what does Israel have to offer to the United States? Like, what are, this is a geopolitical situation. This is why it makes rational sense for Israel to be allied to the United States. It's not even on the wavelength of Zionists or Hasbarists or the general Jewish community to even say these kind of things. It's like they haven't thought about it. They don't know what the arguments even would be. You would probably do a much better job of going on CNN and arguing for why America should have a relationship with Israel than any Zionist propagandist would, because they have no idea what they don't know what's in it for America. They have some vague sense that Israel provides America with lots of tech or spies or intelligence or blah, blah, blah. But in terms of specifics, they haven't got a clue because it doesn't interest them. As far as they're concerned, they have this great story. Americans should buy into their story. Most of them don't anymore. Well, it's because they're anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's if you could put me in touch with anybody, by the way, I'd love to. I'll be the new geopolitical strategy. Like, that's the reason why I've often said I'm willing to sell out for an embarrassingly small amount of money. So, BB, if you're listening, give me a call. But jokes aside, I think that's that kind of touches on two other things I wanted to talk to you about. So you've talked a little bit about like some of these deep divisions that exist in Israeli society, and I was wondering if you wanted to speak on that a little bit, since that's again, that's something that I think there's both on the left and the right, there is this idea that Jewish society, or I guess Israeli society, that is this monolith. And some of the interesting insights of your writing is there's I'm trying to remember who it was. There's this Jewish poet who said something to the effect of, like, Jews are just like everybody else, only more so. So to that end, when you look at Israeli society, at least my understanding from your writing and people kind of in your ilk, if you are, quote unquote, like a more chuddish person or a more woke person, you can find either an enemy or an ally in Israeli society, because it sounds like it's I don't want to be pejorative, but based on what you're saying, it sounds like it's kind of a mess over here, and every problem that you see in the West, like I said, it's the same but only more so.
Okay, it's the same but only more so, but with one key difference, which we'll get to. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, Israel, the whole idea of Zionism was conceived as a solution for the problems of the Jews of Eastern Europe who lived under the Russian Empire, who were Ashkenazi, obviously, who spoke Yiddish as their language and had a certain culture. And these were people who were, for the most part, detached from traditional Jewish observance, but the kind of background of their culture was a religious Judaism. But a lot of what the kind of they'd freed themselves in the conception from the more ritualistic or legal aspects of Jewish observance, but their basic cultural background was still based upon this Eastern European Jewish culture, which was a mixture of folklore, like any other culture, a mixture of folklore and real law and high spirituality and low spirituality and demonology and blah blah blah. And they came to Israel and built this country, and a lot of the decisions they made about how to build a country was based upon internal feuds that had been going on among Eastern European Jewry. So they decided to resurrect, as they see it, the language of Hebrew instead of Yiddish for a specific ideological reason. It wasn't, as people think today, because Jews from all around the world are coming and they're going to need a common language, so it should be Hebrew. That wasn't what they were thinking at all, because they hadn't really thought about that. They did it because they wanted to reject Yiddish language for internal reasons, because it was a language of exile and a language of subjugation. They wanted to move back to a biblical culture as opposed to a rabbinic culture, and so Hebrew is a language of the Bible as opposed to rabbinic. At least large parts of it are written in Aramaic. And so they developed this new Hebrew culture, which was all about their own internal demons, their own internal feuds thing. And it was a culture for Russian Ashkenazim by Russian Ashkenazim in the Middle East. Now, what happened after 1948 is that most of the Jews in the next 10 years who were living in the Middle East and North Africa came to Israel. Some of them literally ran away because there were anti-Jewish riots kind of provoked by what was going on in Israel-Palestine. Some of them didn't necessarily have to flee so much, but they just came because they saw it as going back to Israel. They also had the same kind of ideas, the homeland of our fathers, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But the point is Israel ended up with an ethnic mix. It's not so much it was against the plan of the original founders of Zionism, it's that they hadn't even thought about it. The idea of the original Zionists had not thought about Iraqi Jews or Moroccan Jews. They didn't have a plan for it. It wasn't because the main reason, the two reasons. First of all, because they were thinking about themselves. And the second reason is because before the Holocaust, the vast majority of Jews globally, worldwide, were European Ashkenazim. And the Zionists had assumed that if we succeed and we build our state, the future population of the Jewish state will reflect the global Jewish population. And then as a result, Ashkenazim will be the vast majority. And if the Jews from Morocco or Iraq come, it won't really matter very much. They won't change anything. They'll just be a minority and I guess they'll mix in or whatever. Unfortunately, what happened is the Holocaust happened. So 2/3 of Eastern European Jewry was killed. And Israel ended up with this, about half of the Jewish population afterwards was of Middle Eastern or North African region. And the only thing that they had in common with the European Jews who had come was the Jewish religion. The problem was that the Eastern European Jews who had come didn't believe in the Jewish religion or practice the Jewish religion. So the only thing that they had in common was this thing that they didn't have in common. So this setup, this is one of the fundamental structural problems of Israeli state and society. And on top of that, as you can imagine, the Middle Eastern and North African Jews do not share the unusually high intelligence of Ashkenazi Jews. So Ashkenazi Jews, depending on who you ask, have an average IQ of 108, 110, 112. Middle Eastern Jews do not. Some of them are more accomplished, some of them are less accomplished, but they're not above 100, let's put it that way. So there's this big innate gap. And some of the conditions of when they turned up weren't so great, that they got put in these displacement camps. They can, kind of things that minority groups in America would also complain about. Depending on your perspective, depending on what facts you might want to cite, you can say they're kind of moaning about nothing, or maybe they're moaning about something. It doesn't really matter. The point is they're resentful of what happened in the early years of the state. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is Judaism entire. At the beginning of the state, as I say, among the Ashkenazim, who were the people who were deciding the state, the proportion of the Jewish population that believed in and kept the Jewish religion was very small and was overwhelmingly anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionist, or like me, non-Zionist, but definitely not Zionist, not committed to Zionism. And this has been completely memory hold, but back then, there was such a thing back then as right-wing Zionism, the Irgun and Lehi, the people who did the King David hotel bombing, who were defined primarily by being more militant than the dominant Labour Zionist stream, but also just more pro-fascist. They thought fascism was cool. There's a lot to learn from fascism. They were big fans of Mussolini, obviously not big fans of Hitler, although the very, very extreme ones even thought maybe something could be worked out there. So that was the right wing of Zionism, but it was very much a minority stream. And also it was mostly, not completely, but mostly very, very fiercely secular, even more fiercely secular than the dominant Labour stream of Zionism, which itself was extremely secular. So the right wing Zionists, some of them were so secular that they invented this ideology called Cananism, which was that it's not enough to go back to being like the Hebrews of the Old Testament and rejecting the whole rabbinic Jewish inheritance. No, we have to go back even further. We have to go back and become Canaanites. So that's how anti-Judaism, though. They were like super double plus pro-Judaism. And there was also on the side this small thing called religious Zionism, but it was extremely fringe. It wasn't important in any way to any decisions that were made in the state. It was just a thing that some people believed at the margins of society, not important. That was at the beginning of the state. So since then, what has happened is a number of things that no one predicted. Number one, the proportion of the population that is observant of Judaism or believes in Judaism has continually gone up, partly because of some people who were secular becoming religious. That has happened, but mostly because of differential birth rates. That's one thing that happened. Second thing that happened is that over time, the population of the population who are descended or principally descended from North African, or Middle Eastern Jews, brown Jews, we can say, has somewhat increased as a proportion of the population, also for differential birth rate reasons, but mostly just become more important just because they're no longer excluded. It's just a kind of a time thing. Like originally, all the institutions were, every top job in every institution was held by an Ashkenazi, and over time that just ceases to be the case. It becomes untenable. You know, in a reasonably meritocratic society, which Israel is, and it even has actually affirmative action. Over time, Middle Eastern Jews became more important, and eventually they achieved political representation. And the Likud, people don't know this outside. This is like the main thing that people like. Most people don't understand, that would like flick a switch and they'd understand much better how Israel works. The Likud fundamentally is the political representation of Middle Eastern Jews within the Israeli political system. That's what it fundamentally does, is represent the interests / beliefs / prejudices / lunacy of the indigenous, if you want to call them, Middle Eastern Jewish population. Jews from Morocco, Jews from Iraq, Jews from Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, etc.
And I'm sorry, just to break in, is that the Netanyahu's party?
Yes, yes, this is the Likud, the main right-wing party. Now, Netanyahu himself is not. Netanyahu is from a very, very elite Ashkenazi family.
He's Polish, I believe, right?
But his party, the vast majority of people who vote for his party are of Middle Eastern or North African origin. And more than that, it's just culturally, that's the ethos. If you have 4 grandparents and they're all Moroccan, you almost certainly either vote for Likud, or if you're more religious, you vote for Shas, which is the religious Middle Eastern North African party, which is a Likud ally. So it's almost the same thing as voting for Likud in a way, as in they're always in a coalition with Likud. But the ones who are not super religious, by default, they vote for Likud. That's their. It's almost like in like an African country, like if you're Tutsi, you vote for this party, and if you're Hutu, you vote for this party. So in Israel, it's not to the same extent. But if you're Moroccan, you almost certainly vote Likud, i.e., you almost certainly vote Netanyahu. So and then the third thing is that religious Zionism, which at the beginning of the state was just this, it was a joke basically, like no one took it seriously. It has grown to become a very, very important force within Israeli politics, and its main accomplishment, which is accomplished very well, is to promote settlements in the West Bank, in the occupied territories. And the fact is, even though they've always been a minority, and for most of Israeli history up until October the 7th, their views were also a minority view. Israel has this proportional representation system, which means that every government is a coalition. And basically every party that joins has to say, what are the issues that are most important to me? So the ultra-Orthodox parties, what are called the Haredi parties, say the most important issue for me is money. Give me money. I don't care. Foreign policy, domestic policy, we'll do whatever. The religious Zionist parties, their most important, really their only important issue is settlements in the West Bank. So regardless really of what Israeli public opinion has been, in every single government, that's been what they've been pushing for. And in this on this issue, the anti-Zionists are right, which is that the settlement movement has been so successful, there's it's not realistic anymore that they would ever be uprooted to form a Palestinian state. They have successfully stopped there being any possibility of a Palestinian state. You can think that's good, you can think that's bad. I actually think that's, in a very narrow sense, I think it's good. I don't support the settlement movement for different reasons, but I actually think blocking a Palestinian state is good because I don't think it would be a solution. But they have successfully blocked a Palestinian state. So to sum up all these issues, Israel, which was founded as this secular country for European Jews fleeing persecution to go and kind of LARP at being like King David or whatever, but not religious, has become a country that is, the dominant cultural trends are A, Jewish, B, Middle Eastern, and C, to a large extent, motivated by the ideology of religious Zionism, which there are different types of religious Zionism. I don't want to say that, someone might get upset if they're listening and say, oh, he's stereotyping. The dominant stream of religious Zionism, which is called Cookism, believes that if Jews build enough houses on enough parts of the land of Israel, this will set off a cosmic process of redemption that will lead to the liberation of all mankind, the end of want, the end of war, utopia, etc. Now, some people might say, isn't that quite dangerous that you have an insane utopian cult kind of driving a significant part of government policy? And I would say, yes, it is.
Wonder what that would be like.
Like it's bad. But that's the reality. And there's no point in sugarcoating anymore. Like, I think one of the things I think that, I try to do in my blog, I try to make Jews say, look, calm down. Like, it's not all anti-Semitism. Like, there's the climate of opinion regarding Israel, especially in America, is changing. Chill out and try and deal with it like intelligent adults. That's one thing I'm trying to do. And another thing I'm trying to do more within the Orthodox community is say, look, you've been looking at these cookist messianic religious Zionists all this time as basically like harmless eccentrics, okay? But they're not harmless eccentrics, okay? You have to actually do, it's got to the point where you actually have to do something about it. Maybe, I don't really know what to do, but the first thing is to build up some kind of awareness among other religious Jews that, like, just stop winking at this stuff, okay? This stuff is really crazy. Like, I don't want to say it's the same as Al-Qaeda, because it's not the same as Al-Qaeda, but, like, it isn't a million miles away from Al-Qaeda either. It's the same kind of level of demented as Al-Qaeda, and we messed up by allowing this thing to grow. So, have you heard of Yeshiva University?
No, I've not.
Okay, so Yeshiva University is the fledgling educational institute of modern orthodoxy in the United States. And it's in New York. And so it's called Yeshiva University because it's a yeshiva, i.e. a Talmudical college, and a university. People get degrees in law, chemistry, whatever, right? And the image and the ethos of Yeshiva University is very much what people might think of like if you're philo-Semitic and you're American, which is like people who wear white shirts, who have the nice side parting, wear a nice kippah, they help old ladies across the street, they work really hard, they pay their taxes, they buy a big family, they buy a big house for their family, they're super big on education, strong communities, blah, blah, whatever. The philo-Semitic stereotype of an American religious Jew. That's what Yeshiva University is, and that's true. That is the ethos that they inspire on their people. But they are linked to institutions in Israel or the West Bank, yeshivas in the West Bank, where the ethos is, if we build a certain amount of shacks on a hilltop in the Shomron, even though it's surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Arabs who resent our presence and it causes endless bloodshed by being there, this will institute universal redemption and like a cosmic metaphysical change. And that is a ridiculous situation that has developed. And institutions like Yeshiva University need to stop doing this. They need to apologize for what they've done. And they need to actually start fixing the problem. And I don't know what proportion of the audience listening to this even know what I'm talking about at this point. But for those who do, this is an important message, and it's not a joke, and it's way too late, and we need to be doing this yesterday.
Well, I think that that's kind of what I was alluding to a moment ago, that there's this and it dovetails with some of the Christian Zionism stuff, like the Christian evangelical. I also think it's something that has been somewhat overstated, the influence of, but it's something that's always existed. And I see there's an interesting parallel between the United States and Israel spiritually. I mean, I guess in the somewhat shared religious heritage, but this like expansionism as kind of like the raison d'etre, and if we could, it's you're going to bring about utopia one way or another. They think Christ will come back. Presumably, the Messiah will finally come. I guess the first time in the Jewish case, but a lot of what I'm just in general reading and trying to monitor the situation, as they say, there seems to be like a collapsing of, we see this interesting bifurcation between like this kind of very extreme religious and ideological bent that some people have. And I think there's been like, the very glib kind of answer to all this stuff, like, oh well, it's just about money, it's just about power. And at the end of the day, you can just deconstruct things in a materialist sense, and that's what it all boils down to. But I feel like and part of the other thing I want to talk to you about is like mold bugism and what you've talked about, and also writing about being kind of like an aspirational normie. And I think this all kind of looped together in the sense that I've had back in the day I had a little bit of interest in mold bug, partly just because of it seems like it was like, I think 2018, something like that, is when I first heard about monarchism. And I legitimately thought somebody was just being obtuse or trolling. It's like, yeah, I'm a monarchist. I want there to be kings and queens. I didn't think they were serious. And then I looked into mold bug, and this kind of led me to you and other people. And you talked about mold bug versus Curtis Yarvin. And I think that's an interesting distinction, especially post 2024, 2025, that is, Donald Trump administration. But all that having been said, there is this like very realpolitik that he and other people have talked about, where we're seeing kind of this idea. He talks about the cathedral, and I think probably some of the audience is familiar, some aren't. But in any case, so we have what previously seemed unassailable. This liberal world order he calls the cathedral, somebody like Paul Kingsnorth might call the machine. It seems like to me, just because of basic material conditions and historical forces, it seems like it's kind of running out of gas, and we're kind of returning to this more holistic form of politics. When you're talking about essentially Israeli politics falling under ethnic lines, I think to a certain degree we're seeing that in the United States and across the world as well. This idea of politics as something larger and more aspirational, and more symbolic, that could be more inclusive, seems to be falling apart. And maybe that's where I kind of separate myself from some of the more chuddy things. It's like, liberalism is falling apart, and that's a good thing, and now we're going to be based forever. I tend to be like, well, this is, I think you've called it like left mold bugism. I'm kind of agnostic about it in the sense that, like, say what you will about it, but it was a certain system that had a certain amount of stability. And now I another reason why I find the whole Israeli situation interesting, it's because these older ethnic and religious and even geographical realities are starting to reassert themselves. And I guess where that intersects with you talking about being like more of an aspirational normie and stop, being such a word cell, as you would say in the online Substack, I guess, that whole space, where does that come in for you? Because it's interesting to talk about this stuff all day, but you also still have to, as I like to say, it has to pass the I have work in the morning test. You still have to live a normal life. And I'm wondering how, if that question, I guess, topic makes sense, where you see that intersection and where that's going. Because it does seem like it's the trend that I see the world going towards right now.
So one of the things that Moldbug, an essential point of Moldbug, authentic Moldbug 4, is that the system that currently exists, which calls itself democracy, it's Orwellian for a number of reasons, but the kind of prime reason, because what it actually is an engine for suppressing democracy. And the famous way he puts it is that it created this distinction between populism and democracy. Democracy is good and populism is bad, but populism just actually means democracy, i.e. populism means that opinions flow up from the people, and then the government does what the people say. And liberalism is this great big machine for suppressing popular opinion and creating this feedback loop that exists among the intellectual class and the political class, which kind of creates this stable system that is immune to these swells of popular opinion. The only problem is that it's systematically insane. It's important to emphasize that from the Moldbachian perspective, the fact that liberalism suppresses democracy, that's a good thing. That's the good thing about liberalism. The bad thing about liberalism is everything else about liberalism. But the good thing about it is that it suppresses democracy. And the idea of Moldbachism was having another system that can suppress democracy, which isn't systemically insane. That's the whole idea of Moldbachism. Unfortunately, literally nothing has been done to create such a system. It's Moldbug's posts about neo-Kemalism and stuff, which seemed very unrealistic at the time, are exactly as unrealistic now as they were then. Literally no work has been put into how to make it happen on an institutional level, or even just like flesh out the theory of what you would do to do that. And Moldbug went to work on Urbit, which is a real thing in a real world, sort of. It's on computers, but it's sort of real. I still don't really understand what Urbit's supposed to do, but it isn't that. It doesn't like put his political ideals into practice or anything. It's just anyway. What we are actually experiencing is a resurgence of what Moldbug calls populism, i.e. real democracy, i.e. opinions flowing up from the people into government. Now, under liberalism, when kind of populism was so dejected and almost humiliated, you can kind of kid yourself into believing that these people are actually quite, that the people are quite reasonable. And actually, maybe it would just be better to have the people running everything, because what were people asking at the time of the Tea Party? The rhetoric was a bit mad, but really, the Tea Party was just like lower taxes and stuff. Like, that's fine. I mean, maybe you've got an issue with how you're going to cover expenditures, but it's not a crazy thing to want lower taxes, etc., less regulation. That's fine. That's cool. What we're seeing now is that, populism really bad. Populism really sucks. This whole, this is, the left Moldbug, deep left analysis, right?
Yeah, I went on his show actually.
Yeah, okay, so he's really going for it at the moment with this whole Jeffrey Epstein thing. Don't call the goyim cattle. Cattle are a higher form of life. like this stuff. This stuff is so
him or Hanani, I don't know if they actually believe what they say, but they believe, or they're just being a provocateur in that sense. I can't quite tell.
But, I saw on Michael Tracy, he wrote recently that there's some professor, I don't remember, some university who exchanged an email with Jeffrey Epstein, or maybe 5 emails with Jeffrey Epstein or something. And then the university has now removed all his research from their website, and they're putting in investigation about whether to fire him and stuff. And there's no even allegations of impropriety on his part, like nothing. It's like he sent an email to someone who was a criminal. It's really, that is gross. To me, I agree with the left Moldbachians and the right, or any real Moldbachian, the whole idea of people go on an internet forum and look through some documents and get some university professor fired because he sent an email to someone. That's disgusting. That is I find that viscerally repulsive. But there's also more serious issues, which is that populism is really bad at doing any kind of government. And the key issue, Trump's tariffs. The issue that really radicalized Hanania, he was on that trajectory, but he really radicalized over the tariff issue. And he is fundamentally correct that Trump's tariff policy, which isn't his, it's not like a policy of the Trump administration, it's his signature policy, is just imbecilic. Even if you believe that tariffs are like a part of the toolkit of industrial policy or tax raising in the modern economy, whatever, there's no way of defending the piece of the garbage thing that he came out with, made on some stupid made up formula, so that there was, he originally put 60% tariffs on Madagascar or whatever it was. Why? Because we don't export anything to Madagascar because it's poor. We only export America. We only import vanilla from Madagascar because it's the only country in the world where you can actually grow vanilla. So therefore, we're just going to impose, because we have this massive trade deficit with Madagascar, therefore they're ripping us off, we're going to impose a 50% tariff on Madagascar to do what? To make vanilla more expensive. And what? It was so senseless, so bizarre. And look, I don't know about you, I own gold. This is something I wrote about a few times in notes. I own gold. So the last couple of months, I've been looking, open up the computer. What's happening to the gold price? Oh, I made $30,000 last night. Okay, that's nice. But the point is, it's nice for me and all the other people who bought gold because Peter Schiff told us to in 2010, right? We waited. Now it's payday. But the warning signs for the global economy are flashing very, 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 very red. This is really bad. This is terrible. This is terrible stuff. And it doesn't even have any, and I mean any of the alleged upsides, because he hasn't increased industrial employment in the United States at all. In fact, he's just decreased it, and it was obvious. And it's not even hard to understand why, because the tariffs also fall on industrial inputs. So American businesses that want to make things in factories had increased costs because they had to import parts from abroad. So it's harder for them to make a profit. So it's harder for them to. The point is, populism really is just bad. It's exactly as bad as Moldbug says, and like you kind of alluded to, we're getting to a situation where the suppression mechanism of liberalism is falling apart to some extent, but it's not being replaced with something better. So in Israel, liberalism is falling apart. The liberal class are powerless, increasingly powerless. They still have disproportionate power relative to their electoral power because they're still concentrated in positions that require competence. So, for example, the central bank doesn't have a single Middle Eastern Jew working for it. I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. It doesn't. It certainly doesn't have any ultra-Orthodox Jews working for it. And I'm pretty sure it doesn't have any religious Zionists working for it. So the upwardly ascendant rightist coalition is not influencing monetary policy yet in Israel, and as a result, the shekel is still very strong. But there's all sorts of other places where it is, and it just sucks. We haven't got a Moldbugian solution at all. Now, in America, because America is a center of global imperial power, it seems unlikely that the same kind of coalition that is increasingly taking power in Israel will be able to take power in America. As in, I think the Democrats will win the next election, and
more than likely, yeah.
But it injects a lot of ambient insanity into the system, and it used to be the case that under Democrats, the deficit would go up, and then under Republicans it would go down, and that's how it works in most Western democracies traditionally. Now you can say, and I would say, it would be better if it never went up. It would be better if it was always down. It would be better if they had a balanced budget. But there's this kind of thing, leftist, a left-wing party comes in, free stuff, then there's no more money, so then the right-wing party has to cut the budget, and then you oscillate, and it's not perfect, but it's okay. But now, Obama comes in, the deficit, the deficit balloons. Trump comes in, it balloons even more. Biden comes in, it balloons even more. Trump comes in, it balloons even more. Like basic structures that make the Western system of government work are no longer functional at all. This is not good. Like I say, gold's over 5,000. There are big red warning signs that the system doesn't work anymore. And the best bet for some kind of continued stability is that the Ezra Klein types and the Matt Iglesias abundance liberals take over and just find some sort of way to subvert the democratic process, because they're not actually that popular. But it's a bit of a long shot at this point.
Have you read what's his face? I think it was Ezra Klein. I bought it. I haven't read it yet. The Abundance book.
No, I get the abundance liberals is something that I know about purely through Substack. So I know the Richard Hanania presentation of their ideas. Yeah,
the important part is it's I bought it. I'm reading it for something I have that I'm working on upcoming. It's just very interesting because then I haven't read it yet. I know the shape of it. It's very interesting because his whole on one level it's kind of I understand why people dunk on it. It's like, well, guys, why don't we just do good things? Why don't we stop doing the bad things and do the good things? But more deeply, when you dig into it, he's like, the kind of talks about what, interestingly enough, you could even say there's a left Moldbugian angle to it of if we, because government is so inefficient and so bad at doing things, populism and a strong man is inevitable. And to circumvent that populist strong man, we need to just, like I said, do the good things. Whereas, kind of interestingly enough, in actuality, if you look at the American tradition, he's actually making the best argument for a strong man to come in, because be it, as you obviously know, Moldbug and many other historians have, pointed to FDR was kind of a populist strongman, Lincoln or Jackson, whomever. At a certain point, somebody comes and says, all right, no, this isn't working. We're completely overhauling the system. And, somebody like like Peter Turchin or like the Strauss-Howe theory, like allegedly we're on that hinge point. I don't know what it's going to look like. A part of me, it's that the neuroticism of the American psyche is to be perpetually optimistic. And there's a part of me that thinks, all right, we can probably weather this out too. There's still so much to work with. It would take massively fucking up and massively misplaying the hand to have like, a 1990s Russia situation. It seems increasingly like that's more in the cards. I really only in the last couple of years, I was a little bit of a nothing ever happens bro on the long term. Like, there's just so much institutional momentum that the United States has that we'll probably be able to figure something out. Now I'm not quite sure. I don't know what that's going to look like. But it does really feel like, I don't know, because there was, I found it interesting, like leading up. That's why I found, I was never like a full-on Moldbugist, maybe because I'm somebody who, maybe one of my weaknesses, I'm a little bit, as maybe you can tell, like I like the historical analysis. I like big picture. It's hard to like just say, all right, this is my thing. I'm doubling down on it. But more than anything, there was a very big, there was a gulf between, your Moldbug, your Peter Thiels, and the chuds that they allied with. That was very low rent. I think we're seeing a lot of that now. It's just so libidinous that it's instantly self-defeating. To the point where, I wonder if like the whole Trump and Minneapolis thing is this. It makes me wonder if it's a psyop to make it so immigration can never be enforced again. But all that having been said, it does kind of, unless they do the whole crossing the Rubicon thing and Peter Thiel becomes the God King of America, it does feel like that abundance liberalism is going to be, or something similar that has to pick up the pieces, because that's the problem with the populist wing that is the muscle, so to speak, of the Moldbugian Thielite wing, that they're just, I wrote recently about it. It's like, they can't pass the marshmallow test, so to speak, of like, all right, don't be libidinous ghouls for, even ironically enough, to loop it back to the beginning of the conversation, Daryl Cooper was saying something similar, like, don't be libidinous ghouls who take pleasure in bad things happening to your enemies, because not only is that not good for you on a spiritual level, it's not good for your cause, because it's at least for me, incidentally, there's talk about the vibe shift. I knew a lot of people who were like dyed in the wool libs or Democrats, some a small but not insignificant portion of them who privately admitted to voting for Trump for me, or like, I know like, black people or other like non-traditional Republican-based people, or even like, the centrist normie lib. It was just enough for a blowout defeat for the Democrats, which was numerically not that much ultimately in the scheme of things, that I feel like they underestimated the degree to which they blew their shot, is kind of what I feel right now.
So, like you say, it would seem to be the case that abundance liberalism just has to be what kind of goes on from here, because it just has to. But the thing is, in politics, there is no has. If there's no mechanism for it to take power, then it won't take power. Kind of looping back to one thing we were talking about before, is that the American elite is much less Jewish than it was, and that has lots of impacts for me, Israel, Zionism, Judaism, etc. But I think it's the case that it's kind of, you can say a broad brush, that the elite is more nerdish than it used to be. It's more prurient than it used to be. Clearly, Epstein's friends were not particularly prurient, and it's less capable of constructive hypocrisy than previous elites used to be, and it's more reliant on ideology as its coordinating mechanism. From a Moldbugian perspective, ideology has always been the dominant coordinating mechanism of the cathedral, because that's the theory. That's what the cathedral is. It's a political system that works with ideology as a coordinating mechanism. But as we see from the Epstein thing, it wasn't the only coordinating mechanism. Money is also a coordinating mechanism, and also just kind of cultural rapport can also be a coordinating mechanism. And as the American elite does become genuinely more diverse, cultural rapport as a coordinating mechanism necessarily degrades. So when it was just WASP, it had quite a strong cultural rapport. Then when it's WASP plus Jewish, also less, but also. And now when it's genuinely very diverse, maybe it doesn't have any cultural rapport. And maybe the only way it can coordinate is through ideology. And therefore, maybe people like Ezra Klein just actually can't win anymore. There's no way, there's no mechanism for them to kind of say, maybe the only way to work is to use the other route, which is money. Maybe they just literally have to bribe every single politician in the Democratic Party to not be insane. Maybe that's the only way to fix the system at this point. So the fact that it seems so obvious that this is how the system has to write itself doesn't mean it has to do it. Like, sometimes things can just fall apart. The original failure mode of democracy, which is what America is experiencing as this upsurge of populism democracy, is the American Civil War. So America became like a mass franchise society in what, like 1830 whatever, when Andrew Jackson extended the franchise. And it only took 25 years for it to devolve into civil war. And it devolved into civil war over an issue which hadn't even really been polarizing like 25 years before. You know, everyone knew there were states that have slavery, there were states that didn't have slavery. There were some new states who were making, are they going to be slave? It was a dispute, but it wasn't like the American founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, they write about slavery, but they didn't see it as this fundamental kind of, there's that quote from Jefferson that this is the thing that the Union will be broken on, but fundamentally, most of the time, it was an issue among issues, right? And then suddenly, by 1850, because you have democracy, you have these two parties which compete for power by competing for votes. So they just compete by making their side scared enough to turn out to vote and full of hatred enough to turn out to vote for the other side. Suddenly, you have these two political parties that just really hated each other's guts, genuinely wanted to kill large amounts of the other side. And it wasn't just the North, which were extremely radical and had this whole abolitionist ideology. The South had become complete lunatics. They had this whole ideology that slavery was the best thing ever happened. It's not just I have a slave and what are you going to do? And, it's hard to farm in Florida, etc., which was the original justifications for slavery, right? They developed by the Civil War this whole ideology of slavery is the most ideal thing, and we're going to conquer the whole North American continent. The only place we're not going to conquer is New England because it's a disgusting place full of vermin, and you can't have a good economy. So these two sides developed these lunatic political ideologies based upon hating each other, basically. So that's one failure mode of democracy. That one seems it can't really happen. I kind of buy the idea that a civil war in America is basically impossible because the military is too powerful. Just technology makes it impossible.
Agreed.
So that can't happen. So what can happen? What is the failure mode? So presumably the failure mode is something like what you're saying, right? Just things just become so dysfunctional. But can America become that dysfunctional? Because somewhere needs to be the center of global commerce and global banking and global science, etc. Right? So, can it? Is it possible? Would it mean that the entire world becomes dysfunctional? Or, of course, there's, the other thing is maybe it's all irrelevant because of AI. And I wonder how much, someone like Peter Thiel, he's sitting there, if you actually talk to him and he said, look, things are not going well with your whole populist mold revolution. Like, this is not good, right? Maybe just say to you, I don't care because of AI. And one of the things that the Trump administration is doing is it's removing all the safeguards from AI development. It's giving them massive tax breaks. Even the safeguards that are designed to restrict Chinese development of AI, even that they're getting rid of. So maybe that's what the Teal guys, the Teal guys, they're just not that big on humanity when it comes down to it. Mm-hmm. They're not that bothered by humanity, and so if there's no solution that involves humanity, okay, well, too bad. Maybe that's what's going to happen. We're all going to be enslaved. By machines, except for Teal, who's going to cut a deal.
That's the scary part to me, honestly. Just at least to me, like especially be it not Teal, from what I understand it, but Zuckerberg, Bezos, whomever, these guys were all totally bought into liberalism and everything, except when it kind of lined up with the Democrats might start to regulate AI. And then oh, all of a sudden, yeah, Mark Zuckerberg is based now. And it's like, oh, sorry about all the censorship guys now. There are two genders. I'm all about UFC and alchemy. To me, like, I don't know how somebody could buy that. I don't know. Maybe it's true. I have a hard time trusting the zeal of a recent convert. And I don't know. It sometimes feel like AI is kind of a Hail Mary to save this whole system. I'm not 100% bought, at least, maybe long term, but in the short term, I'm not 100% bought in on that. But that's maybe a separate conversation, because that could be a whole nother hour easily about the long term viability of AI and what you mean by AI, etc. But I think this is probably a good place to start winding things down. I was wondering, do you have any final thoughts that you want to impart?
No, we really covered like a lot. No.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I have two final things. First of all, well, I guess three. I'll say first off, thank you for coming on the show. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I appreciated your perspective. Do you have any plugs or promotions, anything that you have coming up in the near future you want to tell my audience about?
No, just subscribe to the blog. There you go.
Okay.
With a paid
Cool.
subscription, preferably.
Paid subscription. The last thing, this is the sign-off question I have for all the guests. We went a little bit doom and gloom today, but I do like to ask, what's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future, though? Is what's something that you're looking forward to, you think is a positive?
Okay. There is actually something, I don't know how much it'll mean to most of the audience, but there is, in Israel, there is a fledgling Maimonidean movement. Now, Maimonidean refers to Maimonides. So everybody get out your Google search, Maimonides, who was a medieval Jewish philosopher and legal scholar. And he's what's called a rationalist. I'm probably losing everybody by this point. But the point is that the prevalent form of Orthodox Judaism, of religious Judaism in Israel, is very much mystically based. So as I said, the religious Zionism is based on this idea that settling the land of Israel, building houses on hills, has some kind of mystical effects in the heavenly spheres. And at the moment, it's still quite small, but I'm kind of adjacent to it in some ways. I've seen surprising signs of a kind of a Maimonidean, I might even say biblical awakening among Jews in Israel, which I think ultimately is not at the moment tied to any kind of political agenda, in as much as it is probably a political agenda I don't agree with. But I think there's a good chance that I think sanity is kind of habit forming. And insanity is definitely habit forming, but I think sanity is habit forming too. So for those of you who are Jewish, if you Google a YouTube channel called Shivrei Luchot, it's a Hebrew language YouTube channel, and look at his videos, and that you'll see that's what I'm talking about. And that's actually the one thing that it's the only thing that makes me hopeful. Partly because at the end of the day, I'm a religious guy, and I do believe that if the Jewish people do the right thing, then God will show us divine favor. But on top of that, or even in the absence of that, I think that it would lead to the political expression of Judaism within Israeli politics being a lot less demented and destructive than it is today, and in fact even being a positive thing. And it's something that I got extremely depressed about over the last 10 years. And it's only really in the past 4 months that I've allowed myself once again, just a bit, to believe that something positive might happen. But again, I'm not sure. I've probably just lost everyone. But anyway, Shivrei Luchot for those of you who can understand Hebrew.
Well, hope people will go ahead and check it out. And I appreciate you coming on so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot. And have a great day.
You too.